wisdom,
prudentia,
justice,
justitia,
temperance,
temperantia,
courage.
fortitudo.
Applying ancient philosophy to modern life, this is the Sunday Stoic.
Welcome to the Sunday Stoic podcast. This is Steve. Going to jump ahead a bit. We were going to put Epictetus off till next month, but we're going to get a preview of the teachings of Epictetus this week because Michael Tremblay, a PhD student in Canada who's studying the philosophy of Epictetus, emailed me not too long ago saying he'd love to be on the podcast. And next thing I knew, he was also on CBC Radio, and his blogs were being shared a lot on social media among the practicing Stoics. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to hear from someone who's really studying Epictetus in depth. On this episode, Michael will discuss the moral teachings of Epictetus, his educational program. We'll talk a bit about who Epictetus was teaching. And we'll even dive into some of the controversial subjects that we hear brought up by non-Stoics, like, well, if Epictetus was a slave and he knew the horrors of slavery, why didn't the Stoics do something about it? Which is a worthwhile question to ask. We'll also discuss how Michael applies Stoicism to his practice of Brazilian jiu-jitsu and wrestling. So quite an interesting podcast. I hope you'll listen all the way through, and please share this episode on social media. And if you want to support the show, like us on whatever platform you listen to. You can help me out on Patreon to support the show and make a one-time donation on PayPal. To contact me, email sundaystoic@gmail.com. Enjoy the show. Michael Tremblay, welcome to the Sunday Stoic podcast.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
So, Michael, I just listened to you on the CBC radio recently, and you have a great blog out there that's actually been shared quite a bit. You're making waves in the Stoic community. Could you introduce yourself and tell us how you got into philosophy to begin with?
Yeah, great. So my name is Michael Tremblay. I'm currently a PhD student at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada. I study Epictetus, so I study moral education and Stoicism, and the moral education and the pedagogy program of Epictetus in particular. The way I got into philosophy, I think it's kind of a thing that's going to be similar to most other people. I didn't really know what it was. I wasn't really exposed to it too much as a kid. And I started my undergrad in psychology, and I was frustrated with psychology. And I think now that I'm older, I was just frustrated with it because it wasn't philosophy. It wasn't asking the questions I wanted to ask or discussing them in the way I wanted them to be discussed. And I ended up taking some philosophy electives, and I found that was when I was the most engaged and I was enjoying class the most. So I decided to switch over to become a philosophy major. But even at that point, it was still just something I was doing because I was enjoying it. I wasn't incredibly passionate about it. And then in my master's, I ended up taking a course where we had to read Epictetus. And then I fell in love with Stoicism and Hellenistic philosophy and ancient philosophy more in general, and that kind of focus on philosophy as a way of life, philosophy as a way to achieve eudaimonia, and this kind of approach. And from there, it became a passion and a vocation for me. And I went on to I'm doing my PhD right now, and hopefully one day I'll become a professor and be able to research and teach more.
Sounds like quite a trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
What is it about Epictetus that grabbed you?
So I think this happens to a lot of people when they come upon philosophy, or at least Stoicism. I think that Epictetus, or just Stoicism more generally, had a way of articulating thoughts that I had already had for a long time, or ways of thinking that I wasn't quite able to express, kind of intuitions about how to live or about the right way how to live. And Stoicism and Epictetus were providing these articulations of that. And specifically for me, it was this focus on personal responsibility, on personal accountability, on the degree of control we have on determining that we have a good life. So a key aspect of Stoicism is that, happiness is dependent just upon virtue. It's not dependent upon luck or external circumstances. So if you cultivate the right kind of character, you can be happy and have a good life in any circumstance. And I found that really appealing and really intuitive. Thought it's a real equalizing kind of doctrine where it makes a good life accessible to anyone. So that at the beginning is what really stood out to me in terms of Stoicism. As for Epictetus, what I really like about him is he's discussing Stoicism to a particular audience, right? He's a teacher, he's talking to his students, and these are people who are Stoics in training. They're coming to him specifically to learn how to be better Stoics. So he has this intensity about his teaching. He's not trying to persuade anybody about the merits of Stoicism. He's saying, look, you're already here. You already want to do this. You already want to be a Stoic. Here's how you can achieve that. And it's kind of that focus on training and practical application of Stoicism that attracts me to Epictetus in particular.
Maybe you can help me to understand this better, because I'm a biology teacher at a university. I have very little formal philosophy training. Really, I have some exposure to Latin and then reading the Stoics, in English mostly. But I just found it very useful and applicable. But going back in time, these individuals are coming from all over the place to go sit and listen and respond to Epictetus. And he's teaching in Greece, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And so who are these people? Are they people who want to be Stoic philosophers, or are these people in the sense that they're going to be teachers, or are they people who are going to go back to the Roman world or the Greek world and be senators and politicians and things like that?
Well, so you're exactly right that it's the second kind. So it's people who there wasn't seen this, sometimes if you look at Buddhism or other types of lived philosophy, there's this picture that to do it properly, you have to kind of isolate yourself. You have to remove yourself from a social life. You can think of monks in the Christian tradition or anything like this. Mm-hmm. That was not a part of Stoic philosophy, or at least not Roman Stoicism. There was this idea where you could be a practicing, successful Stoic and a part of political life. If anything, political life was seen as a necessary component or a beneficial component of Stoicism, because Stoicism encourages fulfilling your social obligations to other people and interacting as part of a community. So these would be people who would be wanting to learn, similar to, I think, the way people come to Stoicism today, would be wanting to learn a skill set, would be wanting to learn how to go and be a successful politician, or be a successful general or member of the military, or be a successful part of Roman social life. But they saw the skill set that Stoicism had to offer as a component of that. It was this recognition that this type of philosophical training was beneficial mm-hmm. to these ventures. So it was this. It was not primarily, the focus was not something along the lines of, I'm going to learn how to be a Stoic and I'm going to then isolate myself and practice. It was, I'm going to learn this skill set, learn how to embody this philosophy and train myself in it. And then I'm going to return to Rome or wherever I'm from and utilize that in my career or in the rest of my life.
Okay. Now, were these probably like teenagers or 20-somethings for the most part then?
Yeah, for the most part, from what we know, it would have been young men who saw this as part of their training to become men, to become capable adults.
Okay. Now, I've been working my way through Stoicism in the last, basically this season of the podcast, and Epictetus is actually coming up. So if you could just sort of introduce us to where he comes from, and then we can talk a bit about his teachings.
Yeah, great. So Epictetus was born around 50 AD, so he's considered a late period Stoic, along with Marcus Aurelius and Seneca would be the most famous. He was originally a slave, so his name is not even a proper name. It just means like acquired one. So it's really, you really get a picture there. his identity as a slave, as a piece of property, is right in his name. And he was, like some slaves, he was given the opportunity to be educated, and he was studying Stoicism. And then eventually he was granted his freedom, and he was teaching in Rome at the time. And then he was, I can't remember the emperor right off the top of my head, but philosophers were banned from Rome.
Was this
so at this point
Vespasian, or was that before that? I don't remember. I won't claim to know either.
Yeah. I can look it up. But anyway,
that's okay.
At that point, the philosophers were banned from Rome. So he moved to Greece, and he started teaching in Greece, and people would come and travel and visit and come to his school. So that's kind of the historical context. And in terms of his philosophy, he's probably most well known for having the greatest emphasis on ethics, practical and lived philosophy out of the Stoics that we still have a robust amount of theory from.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of, I would say a couple of things that separate his philosophy from other Stoics is, first, he has this incredible emphasis on choice, or prohairis. And he says, in all these places, he says, you're not your body, you're not your possessions, you're nothing but this faculty of choice. And it's this emphasis on identity as faculty of choice, which is really, really important to him, and the center piece of his philosophy. There's wonderful passages where he's imagining talking to some sort of tyrant who's threatening to imprison him. And, he says, well, you'll imprison my body, but you have no way of touching or harming me, because I'm this faculty of choice. And not even God, not even Zeus can alter that or take away that power. So that's one of his main concepts that forms the focus of his ethical philosophy. The other point I would say is he really emphasizes the dichotomy of control, and he really establishes it in a lot of the forms that anything studying Stoicism understand. So this emphasis on making a hard distinction between what is up to you and what is not up to you, and using that as the standard of judgment to determine whether something is of value or is indifferent. So this and that's where his conception of yourself as the faculty of choice comes into play, because anything that ends up being beyond the faculty of choice is going to be not up to you and is going to be some degree of indifferent. And then things relating to the faculty of choice, namely how you deal with sense impressions, are going to be up to you. And then that is going to be what constitutes vice or virtue, good life or poor life. So I would say those are the two philosophical innovations that really categorize his brand of Stoicism.
So I think you're, just thinking of my own reading, he does stress the idea of indifferent things being, just that, indifferent, but the way you relate to them being where the importance is. Like when his lamp is stolen, he doesn't go, oh no, I won't have a light, I won't have my lamp anymore. He's like, well, I guess I learned my lesson. I'll just get a cheaper lamp, and I will let the universe reclaim the nice lamp I had before. It's kind of interesting just to see him take what a lot of people would take as a tragedy. Oh no, what shall I do? And turn it into okay, well, I guess next time I'll just have a cheaper lamp that no one wants to steal. And, and so there are still possessions and things that he's thinking about, but where you aim the focus is your own reaction, your own response, and what you learn from the experience, it seems.
Yeah, I would say exactly. So one of the things, I don't know how much in detail we want to get into his educational program, but the first part of his educational program is mastery of desire and aversion. But then the second part of his educational program is how we deal with indifference. Mm-hmm. And that for him is still, he says, you don't want to be unfeeling like a statue. You don't want to have this, the way kind of Stoicism can be mischaracterized. Right. We don't want to be these people that don't care about anything. Still have a lamp, still interact with others, still fulfill your role as a father, as a member of a political unit. You have these roles. So even though you've mastered desire and aversion, you're still interacting with indifference and you're still carrying these indifference. The question is just, how should we properly do so? It's not,
Right.
it's not this program of totally detaching yourself. It's just, well, what is the appropriate way I should feel when my lamp gets stolen? Not, well, I shouldn't have a lamp. I shouldn't care about anything else besides going off and being virtuous.
You can apply virtue to everyday situations in cases like that, rather than saying I don't care about a lamp. You can say, what's the virtuous way to relate to this situation?
Exactly, and that should be the emphasis, and that does not involve a total detachment from indifference. And in his particular he talks about when we're dealing with indifference, we don't want to be motivated by desire and aversion, because desire and aversions are types of impulse we should direct to things that are good and bad.
Mm-hmm.
When we're dealing with indifference, we want to be motivated by impulse to act and impulse not to act, which is a much gentler form of impulse and motivation. So we still allow ourselves to be motivated towards ends concerning indifference. We just do so in a gentler way, in a more cautious way, such that when things happen that are outside of our control, we won't be incredibly upset by it, or it won't be so unexpected.
So when he starts teaching his students, if I remember correctly, he tells them to focus. If I may be misquoting, but to kind of focus on a few aversions, but to avoid desire altogether. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is exactly it. So in the beginning of his educational program, the first thing you need to do is master desire and aversion. And what is considered a mastery of desire and aversion is when we always get what we desire and we never get what we are averse to. We never get what we don't want. Mm-hmm. And he says, look, the only way you're going to do this, because there's chance and there's things outside of your control, the only way you're going to master desire and aversion is if you end up only desiring virtue and you're only averse to vice. So that's the first step of a moral education.
A moral recalibration.
Exactly. A moral recalibration such that we evaluate and alter our value judgments, such that the only thing we value as good is virtue, and the only thing we are averse to as bad is vice. And he says the first way to do this is to totally suspend desire, because you're just not. If you're a regular person, you're ignorant, you have misconceptions, you have these biases that you developed as you grew up, and you're just going to be pulled in all the wrong directions. So the first thing to do is just entirely suspend desire. Don't even think in terms of things being good and good. And then he says the next thing to do is to suspend aversion, except for things relating to your choice. So entirely suspend aversion, except in terms of vice. Still keep that disgust or that dislike for vice. Mm-hmm. So the idea with this is that if we approach Stoicism without going through this process, I might end up learning Stoicism because I want to seem intelligent, or because I want to impress other people, or because I want to get a job that brings me money. If I don't suspend my desires, they're going to infiltrate and motivate and push me in all of these incorrect directions. So the first thing I have to do is just suspend that kind of process and reevaluate the things in my life one object at a time. And that's the first process. Have
you applied this? Because you're not just interested in the academics of this. You're a practicing Stoic, correct?
Yeah. Well, I try my best. I think one thing that many practicing Stoics need to do is practice forgiveness and practice an understanding that this is not an easy process to do. I do try to do this consistently. And in my dissertation, what I'm researching is Epictetus's training programs. So the methodology. So the question, okay, we know we're supposed to reevaluate our desires and aversions, but how are we supposed to go about doing this? Right. And I look at the training processes he recommends, the method of achieving this. For me, in my internal practice, what I find the most helpful is basically what he recommends is that we have to have a proper standard of judgment by which we evaluate things. And then you have to make sure you evaluate them by that standard of judgment. So there's things that I just out of bias or habit might value or might be averse to. But when you apply a standard of judgment, namely, does this relate to a good life to me? Is this necessary for me to be happy, or does this harm me? Mm-hmm. When I apply that standard of judgment to something, a lot of those kind of fears dissolve, right? So if you look at someone, someone insults you or someone's really rude to you, and just out of habit, just growing up, you're just going to be upset by that.
Right.
But then you apply a standard of judgment. Has this harmed me? Has this taken away anything of value from me? And then when you look at it in that light, your evaluation of it as bad kind of goes away. At least for me personally. And the same thing for evaluations of good. How does this benefit me as I essentially am, as a faculty of choice, as a rational being? And when I apply that judgment, a lot of things I took to be good or valued, I'm able to reevaluate them. So that's my personal. Yeah, and it's a long process. I think it's been fairly successful so far.
And then, so after desire and aversion, what was the second focus of his?
Once you've mastered desire and aversion, the second area of study is how you relate to the things that you've now evaluated to be indifferent. Mm-hmm. So once you've done this, you end up with very few things that are good and bad, just virtue and vice. So the question then is, well, how do I relate to, my job or my family or my friends, given this? And what he recommends, it's really lovely. I think it's the right solution to this. He says we just make reference, because Stoicism is deeply grounded in nature and what is natural. When we're dealing with indifferent objects, we're just making reference to our given roles. So he says some roles are going to be given to us by God. So God might give you, sickness, or might give you fortune. This is a role that has been given to you by fate, mm-hmm. essentially. And we try to act corresponding to that role. We try to accept that role. Another role we might be given might end up just being developed. So I might gain the role of being a father, or I might gain the role of being a brother. And there's some obligations that come along with that. And then other ones I might infer by reference through my talents. So he talks about, wrestlers, they can examine their body and say, oh, I'm particularly talented at physical things. So I should try to cultivate this and pursue a degree of excellence in this. So we give reference to our roles. I think it's really easy if you think about family roles or political roles. And then from that, we try to follow those in an excellent way. And what I think is really nice about this, because there's often this misconception about Stoicism that it encourages you to be apathetic. Like, it doesn't encourage you to be political, or it doesn't encourage you to be, to try to change external circumstances. And Epictetus explicitly argues against this. He says, look, and this refers to the second area of study, dealing with indifference. So look, only the person who has mastered desire and aversion is able to appropriately deal with indifference. And he uses the example of Socrates, who is able to go off to war and fight for Athens, and then he's able to accept his punishment, his execution by the state. So Socrates is able to fulfill his obligations to the state as a soldier and as a member of the court system, or as a member of that judicial system, mm-hmm. because he has mastered desire and aversion, right? And because he is free from these kind of fears and desires that regulate the behavior of other people. So this is actually a really empowering kind of message of political activism or social activism, such that the idea is that I'm going to be able to be politically active when I'm not afraid of being thrown in jail, or losing my job, or being persecuted for my views that I think are right. So the idea is that only when I'm free of the desires and aversions about external things am I going to be able to appropriately fulfill my role politically. If we look at it in terms of the family, there's the example, he has this story of a father who whose daughter is sick, and the father runs away because he can't deal with the grief.
My son was just sick, and I understand his. I understand the emotional drive. Just I'll come back when everything's better.
Yeah, I can't. I mean, I want to give my full empathy because it's hard for me to understand that, as I'm not a father or anything like that. But the point was that the point of his story is that this father's desire to control, what's going to end up happening to his daughter causes him to actually give up or not able to fulfill his role as a father. He ends up leaving because he's so upset. So that's an example of how unregulated desire and aversion is actually impeding the father from having his appropriate relation with what is indifferent, namely I know this is a hard, extreme claim, but the health of the child. Right.
But still, the health of the child is beyond his power to control.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
So once we have worked on our relationships to which indifference are worth making a part of our lives and which we're not concerned with, then what's the third piece of the puzzle then?
Yeah, so the third area of study is a relationship to logic, and this is about achieving certainty in these matters. So we talked about we want to achieve certainty such that we preserve this knowledge and these relations, even if we are drunk, even if we experience madness, even if we experience depression or something like this. We want to be able to preserve these appropriate relations. So the third area is logic, which just cements our understanding of what we have already achieved, and we achieve this degree of certainty. And this was something we see in the history of Stoicism. There's this real emphasis on solidity of virtue. The achievement of virtue it's not something you achieve for 5 minutes. It's something that's supposed to be preserved for really, really, it's very hard to dislodge. So this is something something we see in Epictetus, again, this emphasis on certainty. But Epictetus is really concerned that a lot of people, especially when they approach Stoicism in an overly theoretical matter or overly academic matter, they overemphasize logic and they spend too much time worrying about the way certain arguments fit together, or even just the nature of rhetoric and argumentation and logic itself, instead of worrying about adjusting and perfecting their own behavior and their own beliefs about certain objects. Mm-hmm. So he thinks that these areas of study have to be mastered progressively. So first I have to master desire and aversion before I turn to externals. Then I master externals, my relationships to externals, and then I master logic to solidify what I've already achieved. But he has this passage where he says, look, if you go straight to logic, you're trying to solidify what doesn't exist yet. You're trying to, achieve certainty in something you don't know. It makes no sense.
So the third step is like adding the rebar to the concrete. It solidifies everything once you've achieved it to kind of lock it in place, if you will.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So let's step out of that for a moment then and switch gears for just a second and talk about, you have an interesting life outside of the classroom. Could you talk a little bit about your extracurricular activities and how Stoicism relates to your training and your performance in those activities?
Yeah, so I'm a serious Brazilian jiu-jitsu competitor. I'm a black belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and I've competed at the professional world championships in Abu Dhabi, representing Canada there. I've fought professional MMA. I'm 4-1 in MMA, which is mixed martial arts. Mm-hmm. I wrestle for Queen's University, so I just came 5th at University Nationals in Canada for wrestling. So I am a serious athlete, a serious practitioner of martial arts originally, before I came to Stoicism.
Okay.
And so I see a significant, I'm interested in developing further this significant relationship between martial arts and Stoicism, or more particular, I just think a practice of something that a difficult, highly skilled pursuit and Stoicism.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested in the way, I think you could achieve this through rock climbing, or even something like guitar or musicianship or anything like this.
Whenever I get in front of people with a guitar, I try to remember the idea that the player should not aim to please the audience, which is out of their power.
Yeah.
Because
Epictetus has this wonderful passage about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was going to say, there's a lot of references, or at least several, to wrestling or to athletics in some form or another within. I know Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius mentions it once or twice for sure. So how does Stoicism now affect your emotional state, if you will, during a match or during training?
Yeah, well, I actually presented a paper on Epictetus' discussion of wrestling, because he doesn't just talk about wrestling. He's very explicit that philosophy is like wrestling, and a good philosopher is like a good wrestler. And the points he makes there are essentially that the wrestler encourages and is excited by difficulties and challenges. So a good wrestler will want a hard training partner and be disappointed if they don't have one. And he encourages us to cultivate the same kind of perspective towards fate. When fate ends up treating us in ways that we might consider to be unlucky, he says we should be excited or grateful for these opportunities to test and practice our stoicism.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of how stoicism affects my competition and my training, I think it has made me less angry. It has made me more focused on what matters to me. I used to get upset after losing or get very nervous before a big important competition.
Sure.
And it's helped me understand there's this theme that runs through high level competition, which is a Stoic theme, which is this emphasis on what is in your control. And I think of Musashi, who's a samurai who wrote the Book of Five Rings, and he fought multiple people to the death in samurai duels, and he wrote this book about performance. And he says, think neither of yourself nor of victory, only of proper execution of technique. So don't make a reference to your ego. Don't make a reference to what externals you might gain in that circumstance. Only think of what you can do in that moment to best ensure ideal performance. And I think this is a Stoic conception of how to relate with fate. And I think that's a perspective that helps my athletic performance, not just my athletic performance, but I bring that when I'm presenting philosophy, when I'm teaching. That's always something I carry with me that I took from Stoicism, which is just focus in the moment on, the impressions you're receiving and how to deal with them appropriately. And if you do that, you will maximize your chances of doing well, given the tools you currently bring to the table. And if you still fail, that's because you did not have the appropriate tools for that situation yet, or perhaps ever, depending on what the situation was. But that there's no failure there. You did all you could do. That's the extent of your virtue in that situation. Go ahead.
Oh, is it Epictetus that says when you begin training, you'll stop blaming? I forget how it goes exactly. You'll stop blaming others. When you complete your training, you'll stop blaming yourself, or something along these lines.
Yeah, it was like the beginner blames others, the person making progress blames themselves, and this is also a paraphrase, but the person who's completed the training blames neither.
Right. I could see that kind of relating to this idea of, much like the Stoic archer, you've prepared as well as you can, but you don't know the exact circumstances you're going to face at any time. It's all contingency based, and you do your best, focus on your technique, and then what happens next is an indifferent and not a matter of blame.
Well, that's exactly. It's this movement from externalizing blame, and then you internalize blame to then gaining this kind of cosmic perspective where you understand, well, that was a reflection of fate, and I had no capacity to control that. I only had the capacity to control my aim, and I did that, so there's no one to be blamed if I miss at that point.
Are you teaching as well now as a graduate student?
So I teach, I TA, but I'm not, I've taught a couple lectures, but I teach jiu-jitsu. So I teach, and there's a lot of philosophy you put into jiu-jitsu. And when you're teaching martial arts, a lot of people come to this not just for a physical skill, but they come to it for the perspective because there's this cultural relationship between martial arts and philosophy, typically Eastern philosophy, but I think there's a strong connection with Western philosophy as well, especially things like Stoicism. So when I teach Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I'm always relating, maybe not explicitly as Stoic ideas,
Sure.
but communicating Stoic ideas.
And I'm sure once you've spent a little time teaching, as you have now, then you could get a better feel for what Epictetus was up against and what he was trying to accomplish through some of his lessons. I was going to ask you, so his teachings then are the argument is brought up, and you've kind of alluded to this earlier about not being a nasal gazer. I didn't say that right. Not being a navel gazer. There we go. Not being a navel gazer, a philosopher just sitting at home and staring at your belly button. It's brought up a lot. Like Epictetus himself was a slave. And we have this idea of the cosmopolis and all of that, but Epictetus didn't stand up and say we should push to get rid of this system, let's say, like of slavery, but instead, we can at least interpret some of the readings of the Stoics, the writings of the Stoics, as saying, well, some of this is your lot, and you have to accept some things out of your power, and yeah, for one slave in an empire, there's nothing one person can do, but do you think those critiques that Stoicism didn't end an institution like slavery are valid, or are we just applying too much of our modern ethics on the past?
I mean, I'm partial towards a perspective which is I think if you're evaluating something, there's a merit to evaluating what happened. Like I want to take off the rose-colored glasses and say, if Stoicism didn't achieve this when it was most popular, apparently it isn't effective.
Right.
Now, whether or not that's a reflection of Stoicism properly practiced or not is a different question.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Stoicism properly practiced does encourage political activism, or would push towards an abolition of slavery. It is probably out of all the ancient Greek philosophies, the most, I think it pushes for equality the greatest. It has this theme of the cosmopolitanism. It encourages the education of women as people who possess reason, thus they deserve the same education and the same potential to be philosophers as men. So there's so much there. I mean, as to why it didn't succeed, that's a valid critique, and that's something worth considering. But we get explicit passages in Epictetus where he's saying where a politician is uncomfortable with the policy of the tyrant, and Epictetus is saying, well, you have to argue for your position. You have to argue against the tyrant. The politician says, well, the tyrant will cut my head off. And he says, well, that's the tyrant's job as a tyrant, and it's your job as a politician to communicate what you think is right in that situation. So do your job, and he'll do his, and fate will occur as it happens. And I think I can't look at that and say that this is a complicit philosophy, or this is a philosophy that encourages, or is not kind of radical about the abolition of unjust practices. There's some sort of failure to graph on in application, and I think that we would have to look at historical and sociological factors. But at least Epictetus's particular brand, I really stand by it being progressive, at least concerning issues of inequality like slavery.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. It's just something that, one of those critiques that will come up, that Stoics focus too much on themselves, whereas we know that you're part of your moral role, if from my understanding, is to be a participant in the society in which you live, not to just cut yourself off. And then, as you said, your role might be to stick your neck out a little bit. That might be the moral thing to do from time to time.
Yeah, I think it would depend on the society, but I think, again, we come back to this point where there's this belief that only the person who is, and Epictetus talks about this in relation of willingness to die. So only the person that is willing to die is free, and only the person who is free to do what they want, and only the person who has mastered desire and aversion, and only the person that understands that they're not going to get anything out of life besides virtue and vice that is worth having or is good for them, is willing to die in these kind of circumstances. So there's this view that, and this was this perspective that we saw absorbed in some ways by Christianity, and you saw martyrdom in this like sense and manner you hadn't seen before. People willing in Christianity to die for their beliefs in such an extreme way. And I think Stoicism was, and you get it a bit in Socrates, but developed further in Stoicism, is an articulation of how that position can be coherent and why people should be able to die for their beliefs. So when I take a view like that, and I mix this, and then you also see the commitment to equality amongst people, the commitment that your concern should extend to all human beings, not just those within your city. This is the idea of cosmopolitanism, is that your polis, your city-state, is the entire cosmos. So your area of concern extends to everybody, which goes against these conceptions of the time where it was like, well, I'm going to worry about, my particular area, mm-hmm. But if that person is a foreigner, they don't have any consideration. It says, no, well, as a human being, they deserve consideration. Even though they're a foreigner, they might be a slave, and that might be justified because they're a foreigner. That doesn't hold up under rational consideration, because our area of concern extends to all rational agents.
Right.
So when you mix those two views, you mix the willingness to die for your beliefs in what is right, the willing to be motivated to act on what is right, and the view that what is right is equality, is equal concern for all rational agents as deserving equal concern. I think any sort of belief that Stoicism somehow encourages pacifism in political activism is either a misunderstanding of Stoicism or an observation of the specific ways that Stoicism manifests itself culturally, which is probably a reflection of this historical problems and the way that Stoicism was dealt with, as opposed to the actual commitments of the philosophy itself.
Well, excellent. That gives me more to think about as well. But yeah, if you read the words, it's clear what the philosophy advocates, and that may well be different as to how individuals put it into action.
Yeah, and for me, that's not an unfamiliar phenomenon, right? That's something we've seen in any sort of ideological or philosophical or religious movement consistently, and there's always this temptation I think can be the easier way is to blame the actions of a couple people or the actions of something as being somehow reflective of the movement or the ideas as a whole, which I think is unfair.
Sure. What do you recommend for an individual who is exploring philosophy? Because so let's say one of two things: someone who's interested in academic philosophy may well not be the same kind of person necessarily that finds and falls in love with applied, if you will, philosophy. Because one thing I liked about Stoicism is that it's very much an actionable concept, not just something to sit and ponder about. If someone was a college student and they're interested in philosophy, there are courses to take. But what about those of us who missed the boat? We have graduated or we're not in college. Where should we start? Should we start with Epictetus? Is that a good place to begin? Or should we start earlier with Socrates? Or where would you begin a process of self-improvement using philosophy as your guide?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. So I think one of the great things about philosophy, and I say this to my friends, and I genuinely believe this, is that philosophy is something you can become excellent at without school. There's just so much access to information. And I think if you have a genuine curiosity, you have a willingness to engage with the texts in a difficult manner, you can do better work than people who are in school and who have their understanding being forced in a certain direction because they have assignments to write or deadlines to hit. So you're not necessarily first thing is that you're not necessarily at less of an advantage just because you're outside of school. If anything, you have a freedom to cherry pick what interests you as opposed to have your learning directed, which is a huge advantage. Second point, when we're turning to philosophy, is I would say, figure out what about philosophy interests you. So I think what unifies philosophy is a pursuit of truth in some manner. And I think truth in general is about self-improvement. It's about the cultivation of knowledge. So that can be moral improvement, but it can just be the improvement of our understanding of the universe and the world and how we relate to it. So figure out what appeals to you, and do that through a survey and really trust your gut on what is interesting. And then from there, if it ends up being, Hellenistic philosophy, it ends up being philosophy as a way of life in the ancient tradition, then do yourself a favor of engaging critically with as many of the schools as possible. But the place to start, I think that Socrates and Plato and Aristotle are really interesting and helpful in kind of getting this theoretical foundation. But I think the proper place to start is just, it might be a bit of a cop-out, but just whatever interests you, whatever you find the most. So if you like Epicureanism, if you like a certain author, if you like Marcus Aurelius, you like Seneca, just engage critically with what texts you have found the most interesting, you have found the most appealing. Just trust that gut feeling. My switching over into philosophy was this process of, I was unhappy in school and I had a gut feeling about philosophy and that I really liked it and there was something interesting there and I decided to pursue it. And in pursuing that, I stumbled upon Epictetus. And then in falling in love with Epictetus, I, would check the back of the references in the back of the book and find other authors. I would Google. And I think that passion, that interest just directs itself. So once you've narrowed down kind of the field of study that interests you, I think from there, just follow your passion and your interest. The reason that I'm hesitant to give any specific authors or texts is because for someone like me, I had labeled myself as a Stoic for so long, and then part of my dissertation research, I had to dig into Aristotle further, and I found myself going, "Wow, this is actually really amazing." And I hadn't dug deeply into Aristotle in a while, and I realized how brilliant and interesting Aristotle was. So I think there's a risk where you might have an interest in philosophy as a way of life, and Stoicism might be the first philosophy as a way of life you've read. So you might think, "Wow, I'm a Stoic, and this is great." But really, there's a variety of other perspectives that still hit upon that interest, and I wouldn't want people missing out on that. So I think just finding what interests you about philosophy, and then from there, letting your interest direct yourself on anything you find interesting, and you will develop your own taste and your own feel for philosophy from there.
Michael, thanks for joining the podcast today. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, just thanks for having me. I find it really interesting to discuss. One thing I would like to add is you can reach me. I'm on Twitter _ Mike Tremblay. I have a website at tremblaymichael.com. And if anybody's interested in what I'm talking about or interested in learning more about Epictetus or Stoicism in general, please reach out, shoot me an email or a message. I love talking about it. I love pointing people in specific directions of texts if they already have a area of interest. But other than that, I'm just glad people are engaging with this topic. I think it's worth engaging with and worth developing further.
I will put links to your website in the notes of the podcast so individuals can find it there. And it's really great to talk to you. It's really I think it's fascinating to talk to someone who's academically in the trenches in Stoicism right now, but also finds it so appealing that they're also living it, and not in a passive way, but you're taking it with you on the mat and taking what you learned from the mat back to the classroom. So that's amazing.
Oh yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I had a really good time, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right, Michael Tremblay, thanks for joining the podcast once again.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Sunday Stoic. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review The Sunday Stoic on iTunes. Become a member of the Sunday Stoic team, earn rewards, and be an integral part of the show by becoming a patron at www.patreon.com/SundayStoic. Contact the show by emailing sundaystoic@gmail.com or by leaving a voicemail at 501-503-3132. To find out more, visit www.sundaystoicpodcast.com. And as Steve always says, carpe diem.